My name is Daniel Russo, and if you had asked me 5 years ago what success looked like, I would have told you it was simple. It was a full dining room on a Friday night, reservations booked 2 weeks out, and a life where everything I worked for had a place to go. I was 38 years old, an executive chef and owner of a high-end Italian restaurant in River North, Chicago, the kind of place where people celebrated promotions, anniversaries, and deals worth more than most homes, and I built it. From nothing, a 1,200 square foot space with secondhand equipment turned into one of the busiest spots in the city. I worked 70 hours a week, sometimes more, and I didn't complain because I believed every hour meant something. I believed I was building a life for my wife Sarah and our 2 kids Emma and Lucas. We had a 2,800 square foot home in Lincoln Park, a clean, quiet street lined with trees that looked like they belonged in a catalog, and from the outside, everything looked right, the kind of life people assume is stable without ever questioning what holds it together. Sarah used to understand that life. She had her own career in corporate consulting, downtown, long hours, high pressure, constant travel. We were the same in that way, 2 people who didn't slow down easily. But then one day, she told me she was done with it. She said she wanted to find her passion, something creative, something that actually meant something to her. She said she was thinking about art consulting, gallery work, curating exhibits. I didn't argue. I didn't even question it because at that point, the restaurant was strong financially. We didn't need her income. And I thought, if anything, she deserved the chance to step back and figure things out. I told her, take the time you need. I meant that at first. It seemed like a good change. She started going to gallery openings in the West Loop, private showings downtown, events with collectors and investors. She would come home talking about installations, artists, deals being made over, quiet conversations. And for a while, she sounded alive again, engaged in something that wasn't just routine, and I thought maybe this was working. Maybe she had found something that made her feel like herself again. But then the small things started changing. She was on her phone more often, texting during dinner, stepping into another room to take calls. She didn't used to do that, not with me, not with the kids around. One night, we were sitting at the table, just the 4 of us, Emma talking about school, Lucas barely focused on his food, and Sarah's phone lit up 3 times in less than a minute. I looked at her and said, everything okay? She smiled quickly. Yeah, just someone from the gallery about an event next week. I nodded and let it go, but something about it stayed with me, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, like the answer was ready before the question was asked. Over the next few weeks, her schedule became harder to follow. She would say an event ended at 9, but come home after 11. She would mention one location, but the car would show somewhere else. When I checked the app, not because I didn't trust her, but because I had started noticing patterns that didn't match. And then there was one named Julian. She mentioned him casually at first, said he was an investor, someone involved in restaurants and art spaces across Chicago, well connected, the kind of person who could open doors that don't open for most people. I didn't think much of it at the time. Chicago is full of people like that. But then his name kept coming up more often. What he said, what he thought, what he was planning, and the way she talked about him, it wasn't obvious, it wasn't inappropriate, it was just enough to stand out in a way I couldn't ignore. I remember one night after service, it was close to 11:30 p.m., the kitchen finally quiet after a long rush. I checked my phone and saw a message from her, just got back from the gallery, heading home soon. I looked at the time and did the math. She had been out for over 5 hours, which wasn't unusual, but something about it didn't sit right the next morning. I woke up early, like always around 6 a.m. to start prep before the kids got up. Sarah was still asleep, her phone on the nightstand next to her. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't touch it, but the screen lit up for a second, and I saw enough to read the name Julian and a message that ended with, can't wait to see you again tonight. I stood there for a second, longer than I should have, not reacting, not moving, just understanding. Because that was the moment everything stopped being abstract. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It wasn't a suspicion. It was something real, something that didn't need interpretation. And as I walked downstairs to start breakfast for the kids, one thought stayed with me clearly and quietly. Something in my life wasn't what I thought it was anymore. I didn't confront her that morning, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood something from years in the kitchen. You don't rush a decision. When the timing isn't right, you wait until everything is clear, until there's no room left for doubt. And for the next few days, I paid attention more than I spoke. I watched the patterns, the way her schedule shifted, the way her phone stayed just out of reach, the way she answered questions a little too quickly, like the explanation was already prepared before I asked it. And the more I noticed, the more it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like direction. One Friday night in early November, The city was colder than usual. The temperature had dropped into the high 30s. The kind of Chicago cold that settles into your bones if you stand still too long. The restaurant was packed, over 100 covers, back-to-back reservations. The kind of night where every second counts, and by the time I stepped out of the kitchen, it was close to 10:45 p.m. I checked my phone and saw her message sent about an hour earlier, heading to a late dinner with clients downtown. Don't wait up. It was a normal message, the kind I had seen dozens of times before, but this time, I didn't accept it at face value. I opened the vehicle app and watched the location of her car. It wasn't moving. It was parked in front of a luxury hotel, just off North Michigan Avenue. Not a restaurant, not a gallery, a hotel. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen, then grabbed my coat and told my sous chef I was stepping out. The drive downtown was quiet compared to the kitchen I had just left. The city still alive, but inside the car, everything felt focused, controlled, like I already knew what I was about to confirm. I parked a block away and walked toward the hotel. The wind cut through the street, sharp enough to keep me fully present as I stepped inside. The contrast hit immediately: warm lighting, polished floors, quiet conversations, the kind of place designed for privacy, not business meetings. I took a seat near the lounge area with a clear view of the elevators, not hiding, not making a scene, just waiting. Time moved slower than it should have, every minute stretching longer than the last. My mind ran through possibilities, explanations, anything that could still make sense of it. But underneath all of that, there was a steady understanding that this wasn't going to be something I could explain away. And then the elevator doors opened, and they stepped out together, Sarah and Julian. He looked exactly like I expected: confident, composed, the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted without resistance. She looked different, not physically, but in the way she carried herself: relaxed, engaged, present in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. They didn't see me at first, and for a few seconds, I just watched, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to see it clearly, without interruption, without doubt. He said something I couldn't hear, and she smiled. Then he leaned in and kissed her, not something subtle, not something that could be misread, a clear, intentional moment that removed every remaining question. I stood up and walked toward them slowly, not angry, not rushed, just certain. Sarah saw me first. Her expression changed instantly, the color draining from her face. Daniel, she said, like she hadn't expected me to exist in that space. Julian looked between us, assessing the situation but not stepping away, which told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been happening. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady. We moved a few steps away from the entrance, not far enough to hide, just enough to speak without an audience. How long? I asked. She hesitated, then said, it's not what you think. I nodded once and repeated the question, how long this time? She didn't avoid it. A few months, she said quietly. I looked at her for a second, letting that settle. Every late night, every message, every inconsistency, finding its place in a timeline that finally made sense. Does he know you're married? I asked. Yes, she said without looking at him. That answer carried more weight than anything else, because it meant this wasn't confusion, this wasn't a mistake, it was a choice made repeatedly with full awareness. What about the kids? I asked, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted just slightly. They're fine, she said. They have you. That was the moment everything became clear, not just what she had done, but how she saw it. I meant nothing in the life she was choosing. I stepped back slightly. Then we're done, I said simply. She blinked like she hadn't expected it to be that direct. Daniel, it's more complicated than that, she started, but I shook my head. No, it's not. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. There was a pause, and for a second, I thought she might say something real, something that showed she understood what this meant, but instead, she said, I felt trapped for a long time, like my life wasn't mine anymore. That was it. That was the justification, and in that moment, I understood there was nothing left to fix, not because of what she did, but because of how she explained it. I nodded once. Then we'll handle it properly, I said, and I turned and walked out into the cold Chicago night. The wind hit harder than before, or maybe I just felt it differently this time, because as I stood there for a moment, looking out at the traffic moving down Michigan Avenue, one thought settled in clearly. This wasn't the moment everything fell apart, it was the moment I realized it already had. The divorce didn't turn into a fight. It turned into something far more unsettling. It became efficient. We sat across from each other in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Late afternoon light reflecting off the buildings, everything around us moving like normal, while our entire life was being reduced to paperwork. Her attorney spoke first, outlining terms, timelines, assets, custody, all of it structured, clean, almost clinical, like this was just another transaction, and Not the end of a family. I listened, not interrupting, not reacting, because I needed to understand exactly how far she had already gone before I ever walked into that hotel. Sarah didn't argue any of it. She didn't push back on the financial split, didn't question the terms, didn't ask for anything beyond what was already being offered, and that alone told me more than anything she said out loud. She wasn't trying to hold on to anything from this life. She was trying to leave it completely. When the conversation shifted to the kids, the room changed, not in sound, not in tone, but in weight. The lawyer explained the custody structure clearly. Full custody transferred to me. Sole decision-making authority, no mandated visitation schedule, no shared parenting terms, everything placed entirely in my control. I leaned forward slightly and looked at her. You understand what that means? I asked. She nodded without hesitation. Yes, I do. Her voice was steady, controlled, like she had already accepted it long before this moment. I didn't move right away because I needed to hear it from her directly, not from a lawyer, not from a document, but from her. You're giving up your rights to them, I said clearly, giving her one last opportunity to step back. If there was anything left in her that would hesitate. She met my eyes for a second and then said, I can't live the life I want if I'm tied down. I need a clean break. The words were simple, but they carried a kind of finality that didn't leave space for interpretation. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't emotion. This was direction. She had already decided who and what mattered, and it wasn't us. I sat back in the chair, letting that settle, not reacting, not arguing, just understanding, because once someone says something like that, there's nothing left to negotiate. The papers were finalized that same week, signatures placed where they needed to be, each one locking in a decision that had already been made emotionally long before it was made legally. When it was done, she stood up, gathered her things, and walked out of the room without looking back, not at me, not at anything that represented the life we had built together. And just like that, it was over, not in a dramatic way, not with raised voices or final words, just a quiet, definitive ending that left no confusion about what had happened. The first few months after that were structured out of necessity. Mornings started earlier than they ever had before. Breakfast, school drop-offs, then straight into work, balancing the restaurant and everything at home without any margin for error. I adjusted quickly, not because I had time to process it, but because there was no other option. Emma and Lucas didn't understand everything, not fully. They knew their mom wasn't there, that something had changed, but they didn't grasp the permanence of it. And I made a decision early on that whatever questions they had, I would answer them in a way that gave them stability, not confusion. I didn't speak about Sarah negatively. I didn't explain the details that belonged to a situation they weren't ready to understand. Yet I focused on what mattered, keeping their world consistent, predictable, safe. The restaurant remained demanding, but I restructured everything. I delegated more, trusted my team in ways I hadn't before, not because I wanted to step back, but because I needed to be present in a different way at home. Over time, that shift changed more than just my schedule. It changed how the business operated. I expanded carefully, not aggressively, not chasing growth for the sake of it, but building systems that allowed it to function without me being there every night. The first new location opened in the West Loop about a year later, smaller, more controlled, a concept that could scale without relying entirely on my time. Then a second expansion followed a couple years after that, each step deliberate, each one built on what had already been stabilized. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy. There were setbacks, nights where things didn't go as planned, decisions that had to be corrected, but it was real. It was built the right way, and by the fifth year, everything had shifted into something solid. The house had changed to a gated property just outside the city, more space, more privacy, an environment where nothing happened without intention. Emma was 10 now, Lucas was 8, both older, more aware, grounded in the life we had built together. Sarah's name came up less and less, not because it was avoided, but because it no longer held the same weight it once did. It became something that existed in the past without needing constant explanation, and that was the part I hadn't expected, not the absence itself, but how natural it eventually became, like a chapter that had closed so completely it no longer felt connected to the story that continued after it. And that's why when the gate opened that afternoon, and I saw her standing there again, thinner, worn down, holding the hand of a small boy who couldn't have been older than 3, everything felt out of place, not shocking, not overwhelming, just disconnected from the life I had spent years building. Because whatever she had become, whatever path she had taken, it no longer belonged to me or to anything I was responsible for anymore. She didn't step forward when she saw me. She just stood there at the edge of the driveway like she understood she wasn't part of this space anymore. The boy beside her held onto her hand quietly, looking around at the house, the yard, the gate. Everything unfamiliar but calm in a way that only comes from not knowing what's at stake. Daniel, she said, her voice careful, almost rehearsed. I looked at her for a moment, not searching for anything, not comparing her to who she used to be, just seeing what was in front of me now. What do you want? I asked. She swallowed slightly, adjusting her grip on the child. I need to talk to you, she said. I didn't know where else to go. I nodded once, then talk. She hesitated, glancing toward the house like she expected something different. This isn't something I can explain standing out here, she said. I need a little time. I shook my head. You're not coming inside. Say what you need to say here. The boundary was clear, and she understood it immediately. Julian is gone, she said. He lost everything. His investments collapsed, and then he left about a year ago. I've been on my own since then, trying to make it work, but it's not enough. Not with him. She looked down briefly at the boy before continuing. I need help, Daniel. Maybe I can stay here for a while, get back on my feet, help with the kids, rebuild something slowly. I let a few seconds pass, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted the words to land clearly when I said them. There's nothing to rebuild, I said. Her expression tightened slightly. I know what I did, she started, but I cut her off without raising my voice. You didn't make a mistake. You made decisions over time, and you followed through on all of them. You chose him. You chose to leave. You chose to give up your rights to your kids. And now you're here because those decisions didn't work out the way you expected. She shifted slightly, her tone softening. I've changed, Daniel. I've had time to think. I understand what matters now. I looked at her steadily. Change doesn't rewrite what you did. It just means you understand it differently after the fact. There was a pause. The boy moved closer to her leg, sensing the tension without understanding it. At least let me see them, she said. They're still my kids. That was the first thing she said. That didn't match reality. You gave that up, I replied. Legally and willingly. You don't get to come back 5 years later and ask for access like nothing happened. Her eyes dropped for a second, then lifted again. Please, she said. Not for me, for them. They deserve to know their mother. I shook my head slowly. What they deserve is stability, I said. And they have that now. What they don't need is confusion brought back into their lives because of something you chose. She stood there, absorbing it, waiting for something to change, but nothing did. I stepped back and pressed the control for the gate. It began to open behind her. You need to take care of your son, I said. That's your responsibility now, not this, not what's inside here. She didn't argue again. She didn't push further. She just nodded once, a small movement, then turned and walked back toward the street, guiding the boy with her. The gate closed behind them, quietly sealing the distance between what had been and what existed now. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the house where Emma and Lucas were inside, unaware of what had just happened. And for a brief second, I considered telling them, but I stopped myself because whatever Sarah had brought with her that day, it didn't belong in their world. Not like this, not anymore. I picked up where I left off. The routine, unchanged dinner, conversation, the steady rhythm of a life that had been built carefully over time. And for the first time since she showed up, I felt something settle completely. Not relief, not satisfaction, just confirmation that the past had no place in what came next. But that sense of finality didn't last long, because the next morning, everything shifted again in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because of Sarah, but because of someone I never thought I would have to question. The next morning, I was already in the office at the West Loop location by 9 a.m., reviewing supplier contracts and prepping for a menu change when my phone rang, and I saw my mother's name on the screen. She rarely called during business hours, which meant this wasn't casual. I answered without hesitation, "Hey, Mom," but there was no greeting on the other end, just a tight, controlled question. Why would you turn her away like that? I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to confirm what that question implied. How do you know she was here? I asked, my tone even. There was a brief pause, then she said, "Because she told me." And just like that, the situation shifted from something contained to something much larger. "You've been talking to her?" I asked. She exhaled softly, like she had already prepared for this. "Yes, I have," she said. "She's still the mother of your children, Daniel, no matter what happened between you two." That sentence didn't trigger anger. It triggered clarity, because it told me this wasn't recent. This wasn't a reaction to yesterday. This was something ongoing. How long? I asked. She hesitated. Not long enough to hide it, but long enough to confirm it mattered. "About 3 years, she said quietly. I stood there in silence for a second, processing it, not emotionally, but structurally. 3 years meant this had been happening behind my back for more than half the time since the divorce. What exactly does that mean? I asked, my voice steady. It Means I didn't think it was right for the kids to grow up without knowing their mother. She said I arranged for them to see her sometimes on weekends when they stayed with me. Nothing disruptive, nothing that interfered with your life. I walked over to the window, looking out at the street below, without really seeing it, because what she was describing wasn't small, it wasn't occasional, it was a pattern, a system built without my knowledge. You arranged visits. I repeated yes. She said quickly, like she needed to justify it before I spoke. I made sure it was controlled. I made sure it didn't cause problems. I was trying to do what was best for them. They deserve to know where they come from. That explanation didn't change anything. If anything, it made it clearer this wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. Repeated over time. Have you been telling them to hide it from me? I asked. There was silence on the other end, longer this time, heavier. We told them it would be easier if they didn't mention it. She said we didn't want to create conflict. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of anger, but to keep the conversation grounded, because what she had just confirmed was something much deeper than disagreement. She had placed my kids in a position where they were expected to carry something they didn't fully understand, to manage two versions of reality, one with me and one behind my back. Did you offer them anything? I asked the question directly, because I needed to know the full extent. Another pause. Yes, she said quietly. I told them I would get them a new game console if they kept it between us. And I told them you would be very upset if you found out, that you might even cry, and that it would make things harder for everyone. That was it. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a clear confirmation of manipulation layered in a way that a child would believe. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see it, because at that point, everything was clear. This wasn't about helping. This was about control disguised as care. You don't get to make that decision, I said finally, my voice steady but firm. You don't get to override legal agreements and parental authority because you think you know what's best. There was a shift in her tone, then less certain, more defensive. I was trying to help Daniel. She said she's their mother, and she's been trying to be part of their lives in a way that wouldn't disrupt things too much. I didn't respond to that directly, because intent didn't matter at that point. Outcome did. You've been undermining the stability I built for them. I said you've been asking them to keep secrets from me, and you think that's helping them. There was no answer to that, not one that could change what had already been done. This stops now, I said clearly. No more visits, no more contact, no more involvement with her unless it goes through me and through legal channels. She started to respond, to push back, but I didn't give the conversation space to continue. This isn't a discussion, I added, and I ended the call because there was nothing left to say. As I stood there in the quiet office, one thing settled completely. What I thought had ended years ago hadn't ended at all. It had just been happening out of sight, maintained by someone I trusted, and now that it was visible, there was only one way forward. Not emotional, not reactive, but decisive, because this wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was about protecting my children from something that had already proven it could exist without my knowledge, and making sure it never happened again. I picked up the phone and called my attorney immediately, not to ask what to do, but to move forward. We filed a cease and desist letter that same week and pursued a strict legal injunction tied directly to the custody agreement, documenting everything: the unauthorized contact, the third-party involvement, the pattern. Over 3 years, Sarah attempted to respond through her attorney, requesting limited supervised contact, but the timeline worked against her. The prior relinquishment of parental rights, the secrecy, the manipulation of the children, all of it reinforced the same outcome. The court upheld the original custody in full and issued clear restrictions that prevented any contact outside of formal legal channels. My mother wasn't charged with anything, but the legal notice made it clear that any further interference would carry consequences. And as for me, I made a decision that didn't require a courtroom. I cut off access completely. No unsupervised visits, no involvement, no exceptions, not out of anger, but because trust doesn't rebuild through explanation, it rebuilds through time, and until that happens, boundaries stay where they are. When everything was finalized, I walked out into the Chicago cold again, the same kind of cold that clears your head instantly, and this time, there was nothing left unresolved, nothing operating in the background, nothing left to question, and that's when it settled in completely. I didn't destroy her life, she did. I just made sure it stayed that way, and when I got home that night, checked on Emma and Lucas, and turned off the lights, there was no anger left, no regret, no second thoughts, just quiet, controlled certainty that everything that mattered was protected, and everything that didn't belong was finally where it should have been, outside. The weeks after everything was finalized didn't feel dramatic. They felt quiet in a way that only comes when something that has been unresolved for a long time is finally contained. There were no more unexpected calls, no more information surfacing from places I hadn't considered, No more sense that something was happening outside of my awareness. The structure held exactly the way it was designed to, and for the first time since Sarah showed up at the gate, I wasn't reacting to anything. I was simply moving forward on my own terms. The routine at home stayed the same: breakfast at the same time, school drop-offs, dinner together in the evenings. The small, consistent details that create stability over time. Emma focused more on school and her friends. Lucas talked about joining a baseball team in the spring. Their world wasn't defined by what had happened, it was defined by what was steady and predictable, and that was the only thing that mattered. I didn't bring up Sarah again, not because I was avoiding it, but because there was nothing left to explain that hadn't already been resolved. I had already given them clarity when it mattered, and now what they needed wasn't more information, it was consistency. The business continued to grow, but I approached it differently than I had before, not chasing expansion for the sake of it, not taking on projects that pulled me away from what I had built at home. The restaurants were stable, the systems worked, the team I had built could operate without me being present every hour of the day, and that was intentional. Success wasn't about how much I could add anymore, it was about what I could maintain without losing control of what actually mattered. One evening, I was in the kitchen at home cooking dinner, something simple, pasta with a light garlic and olive oil base. The kind of meal that doesn't require focus, but still feels like care. Emma was setting the table. Lucas was talking about something that happened at school. Both of them moving through the moment without hesitation, without confusion, without anything weighing on them that shouldn't have been there. And as I watched that, I realized something that hadn't fully settled until that point. Nothing from the past had carried forward into this moment, not the betrayal, not the disruption, not the uncertainty. It had all been contained exactly where it belonged. I didn't need closure from Sarah. I didn't need an explanation from my mother. I didn't need anything beyond what already existed in front of me. Because closure doesn't come from conversations, it comes from structure, from decisions that hold over time, from boundaries that don't shift just because someone asks them to. The house felt different now, not because it had changed physically, but because everything inside it was intentional. Every routine, every decision, every part of the environment we lived in was built on something that didn't depend on anyone else's choices, and that was the part one hadn't understood before. The stability I thought I had years ago wasn't real. It was dependent on someone who didn't share the same priorities. What I had now was different. It was built on something that didn't move. When someone else decided to leave later that night, after the kids were asleep, I walked through the house the same way I had done years ago when everything first fell apart, except this time the feeling was different. There was no uncertainty, no sense that something was missing, no question about what came next. There was just quiet, controlled certainty that everything that needed to be in my life was already there, and everything that didn't belong had already been removed. And as I turned off the last light and stood there for a moment in the silence, one thought settled in, completely clear. I didn't lose anything that was meant to stay. I just removed everything that wasn't.